Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 2. We're on page 1191. Basically, what we're up to is in explaining the two statements, the two phrases in the verse, V'yadaita Ayin, that you shall be aware of, and in a das level, hargosha, feeling and recognition, v'shavesa levavecha, and apply it and draw it to your heart emotionally. Experience havayahu alikim, the unity of the divine and in existence. B'shamayim memal, v'la'oretz mitachas. Shamayim memal, v'la'oretz mitachas are two different statements that now in this Maimer is going further into it. In the previous Maimer, he spoke about negating duality, that the divine is everywhere, both on heaven and earth, even in the material world. And here he's going deeper, where he's saying that Eretz Mitachas is talking about Das Tachten, that in the material world, from Elikim, from the Tzimtzum, we come to recognize from Elikim, Havayahu Elikim, and we do that through the Birurim, through the recognition, like he said on page 1190, that we transform the Tzimtzum of the divine that's concealed in existence by revealing that. And Shemai Memal is Havai de La'elo, Das Elyon, where we come to a deeper understanding of the divine that's beyond existence. The Eir HaBligvul, as he called it. An Eir that was never, in the first place, commensurate with or relating directly to existence, and the divine reality that's beyond existence. And that too has been concealed by the Tzimtzum in order to allow space for existence. Olam is bepshitus, that the world should be an identity. You cannot have a situation where Elikus is bepshitus, that the given reality is the divine. So that was concealed, that Eir HaBligvul. But through the V'yadaita Ayin, through our work, we come to reveal that. And now we're revealing not just the divine, the divine finite energy, but divine infinite energy. And we've been discussing what is the advantage of that. What is the advantage of that? So briefly, what we learned, the advantages of that are, number one, that the divine infinite energy is focused on atzmus. Megala atzmus. The divine finite energy is about radiating into the world. Its purpose relates to existence. So firstly, you have that element. In addition, he spoke about midah v'gvul, that the energy itself, the finite energy, has measure. The infinite energy does not have measure, has no parameters. The finite energy is also subject to concealment. Even when it's revealed, it's still impacted by the Isalmus, by the concealment of the Tzimtzum. And then he said the advantage of the infinite energy, also the Bligvul energy, is that it's even compared to the Primis Hakav. Even if you talk about the essential nature of the Primi, which is all about the divine intention in it, not just the actual finite nature, it also has advantage over that. Because at the end of the day, even though the Primi is a Medida Atzmis, as he put it, it's not a real limited structure. It's a divine choosing to limit. So it's a fundamental, it's an essential type of limitation, not an actual limitation. So it's a Medida Atzmis in that sense. So it's on an essence level, not on an actual level. Nevertheless, it's still defined by definition. That's what the Eibishter wants. That's what God wants. He wants Medida. Whereas, Whereas the Eir HaBligvul does not have that additional element of God wanting to manifest in a structured way. And in that sense, the Eir HaBligvul is mizdame, he says, is comparable to and reflects the part of Ein Sof and Atzmos. But then came the question. Ein Sof and Atzmos is not defined by Ein Sof. Ein Sof and Atzmos simply means that he has no definition. The Ein Sof HaBligvul is defined by the fact that it's Ein Sof, it's infinite. But the amitis in Ein Sof is just shlilas hakol. It negates everything. It negates definition. That's what Ein Sof means. Ein Sof means it has no limits altogether, no definitions, not just no limits. So you can't define it by Ein Sof. You can't define it by Gvul. You can't define it by Bli Gvul. You can't define it by Chiyuv, that it's this. You can't define it by that it's not this. It's shlila as well. Like you said, Kain Zachon Alts. You can't define it in any way, and it's everything at the same time. So what you say that the Ein Sof, the Eira Bli Gvul, is comparable to Ein Sof and Atzmus. Ein Sof and Atzmus is a completely different reality. And now he's going to explain what that means exactly. So what does he mean by that? When it also has that type of infinite distance from Atzmus. Before I continue, I just wanted to point out two things because it was asked to me. One is the issue of Pnimius v'Atzmus Hakav. Besides the pages I already referred to, there was one other place that I think is important to keep in mind, and that is, let me just refer you to it. It's an interesting, very, I think, key parentheses in this regard. Page 1170, the fourth line, he talks about Pnimius v'Kav, Pnimius v'Atzmus Ein Sof. So this is going to be relevant to something we're going to learn shortly. But there he talks very much about that the kavana of the Pnimi, the kavana Pnimis, in many ways is even deeper than the kavana Pnimis of the Bli Gvul. And yet, it still manifests in definition. Because the intention of the definition is to create a dir b'tachtenim, which is rooted in the highest source levels. So it's not a contradiction to what we're saying here. On the contrary, it's telling you that existence, tachtenim, even though it's rooted in the highest levels, but the fact is its existence. And Eira Bli Gvul gives us more of a taste of the undefined, or so to speak, the undefined, the unlimited elements of Ein Sof. That was one point I made. I think someone had also asked me about where's there more about the levels of davening. Remember, we spoke about that Mamata Lamaila in davening. You must go step by step. So what are those steps? So I said that there are many Maimorim about it, but I actually neglected to mention, I didn't realize that when you go back to that page where I referred to you all, where he talks about the difference between Mamayla Lamato and Mata Lamaila. So, meaning that tefillah is step by step. On page 787, he actually goes through the 4 steps of davening, how it is Mamata Lamaila. The same subject, where davening, where by learning you can reach a level that's beyond you, and in davening you can't jump to a level that's beyond you. That would be fooling yourself and could even be somewhat detrimental. So on page 787, he actually talks about the steps in that same subject matter. Just filling in some questions that were asked in the past. Anyway, let's go back to where we are right now. So now the question is, okay, the Eira Bli Gvul, good, reflects and is comparable to Ein Sof in the sense of infinite Ein Sof, but not to the sense of Ein Sof that is undefined, as we just said, because that's the true meaning of Ein Sof. So he's going to now explain how this works. Basically, as I said on Friday, that really every different part of divine revelation reveals to us another aspect of Elokus. Being that Atzmus, as he just said, is undefined in every possible way, there's no one thing that can just tell us this is Atzmus, because any one thing is already not Atzmus, because Atzmus is not defined by anything. So whether it's Bli Gvul or Gvul, or whether it's Chiyuv or Shlila, whether it's interpolation or extrapolation, whether it's a positive, like saying I understand this, or saying I don't, it's not something and negating it, either way is a definition. So you have to conclude that the only way to experience the full Atzmus, well, if you can even, is by looking at all aspects. So the Eira Bli Gvul is giving us a taste of something, but it's not a taste of everything. And that's what we're going to discuss right now. So therefore, we're still in the middle of the conversation that B'Shamayim Mimal, Eira Bli Gvul, that was concealed, that when we come to aware of it, has an advantage over Eira Gvul, in addition to what we said till now, even Gabi the Pnimis Hakav, so because it has something that it teaches us about Atzmus, the infinity, the infinitude of Atzmus. And yet he's saying, V'hagam, that Ein Sof of Atzmus is beyond it all. So now he's going to respond to that. So this is like saying, so Hagam, we said in the beginning, V'Hagam d'masha atzmus ein sof harazeh ba'efen achar mebchinas ha'ein sof shel eira bli gvul. And he goes on to explain why. So now we continue. The line begins, and I'm going to learn inside, is the line that begins, Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashanah Samach Vav, Nizbar Gam Ken Le'il. This is all talking about how Atzmus is beyond the Ein Sof of Bligvul. Is the Ein Sof of Atzmus is not like the Ein Sof of Bligvul, because the Ein Sof of Atzmus negates everything, and is everything. It's everything and beyond everything. So he's not going to say like this. The Inyan Zeh Hu Dafka B'Bchinas Primis Ha'er. This Inyan about Atzmus being a combination of all these paradoxes, that he's everything and he's nothing. He's not defined by anything, and he's at the same time he's everything. And he's not defined by one thing or another. He says this Inyan actually is Dafka B'Primis Ha'er. You actually see this in the Primis Ha'er. Which Primis Ha'er? The Primis of the Kav. So he's now going back and saying, not only does the Eir HaBligvul, the infinite light, not reflect on true Ein Sof, which is beyond infinite, and that cannot be defined by infinity. Actually, the Eir HaGvul, the Pnimius of the Eir HaGvul, actually has a combination of these two opposites more than the Eir HaBligvul does. Why? Because remember, the Pnimius Eir, let's not forget what it is. It's God's envisioning of the Eir Pnimi. So there's the Eir Pnimi where you actually have the workers, the energy, the Kav, actually painting the image of the spheres, Chachma, Bina, Das. And there's actually difference between Chachma, Bina, Das. They're not the same. We learned explicitly that Chachma has its own parameters and Bina has its own parameters. That's Chitzenius HaKav, Chitzenius Eir Pnimi. What's the Pnimius of the Eir Pnimi? Is God's intention. Why is he creating a structure in the first place? Because he wants to have a dira b'tachtainim. He wants to have a structure which will manifest godliness, the finite energy, the infinite energy, and beyond. So the Pnimius is really, he's going to say now, has a combination of two opposites. Sheyesh be'Beis ha'hofchim. The Pnimius is not defined. Remember, we said it's a medida atzmis. It's not actual definition. It's God's envisioning definition. So it has two options. On one hand, there's definition because God's envisioning definition and he's not envisioning non-definition. Remember, Dira B'Tachteinim is a structured existence. But the Pnimis is how God is envisioning it, and that envisioning of it is a Medida, but it's also the Ein B'Medida, because it doesn't really have structure yet. So what do you see from this? That the Eir Pnimi actually reflects more the paradox of Atzmus than does the Eir HaBligvul. The Eir HaBligvul captures the infinity period, just plain infinity. There's no limits at all. But the Pnimis of the Eir has both elements. And he says, U'kamoishin is barley il be'inyan haman. Like we learned earlier about the man, about the bread from heaven. Remember, we learned about the man. The man has two opposites. On one hand, it's bread. They ate it. On the other hand, it was mahu. What is this man? Shehoya b'mida ubli mida. It had both elements. It had measure and non-measure. Divayamudo eisei be'emer. They measured an emer, an actual measurement, the cubic measurement of an emer. In other words, when they gathered the man, they had to measure it. So that's measure. That's clearly midah. And nevertheless, if somebody took more than they deserved, than they needed, it would melt away. They wouldn't have it. And if someone took less than their measure, it increased on its own. Now, something that's measured, if you take, let's say, a quart of something, it's not going to increase. A quart is a quart. A quart is not a pint. An omer is not a kazayas. Okay? And here, on one hand, they measured. On the other hand, it was not bound by measure because the person who took more ended up having the same, and the person who took less ended up having the same. So they all ended up having exactly what they needed. Exactly the same. So we learned earlier that this is a combination of bli gvul and gvul, midah and not midah, measure and no measure. So you can't say the omer is bli gvul, period. The man rather, because it's an omer, l'galgelis. Omer l'galgelis. Every head, every person got one omer. But on the other hand, the omer is not clearly structured like a regular gvul as well. So essentially we have three levels here. We have real gvul, which is defined. We have a gvul that is on one hand measured, but also has an element of non-measure. And then we have bli gvul that's not measured at all. So in this context, the pnimis of the oir has in a sense an element of the paradox that's similar more to atzmus than it is in the oir bli gvul, because it has both elements in it. That's what he's saying right now. Okay. Like we find in Torah and other examples. So he doesn't spell out. In Torah too, we have the same element. On one hand, we say Torah is structured. First of all, Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod. Psukim in Torah, every pasuk has its message. Torah is structured. There are 304,805 letters in the Sefer Torah. That's a specific number. You're supposed to pronounce it a certain way. On the other hand, you say Aruchem Eretz Midah v'Rechava Miniyam. It's Aruchem Eretz Midah. It's longer than the measure of earth, and Rechava Miniyam, and wider than the boundaries of the sea. Basically, it's bli gvul. If you talk on a higher level, what's Torah? Araisa v'kitsha b'richel kulacha. Torah is God's wisdom. Just as God has no limit, His wisdom has no limit. So is Torah bli gvul or gvul? So Chassidus explains, not here, he just hints to it. He just mentions it. We learned earlier that Torah has both elements. There are levels where it's bli gvul, and then that bli gvul comes into a gvul. So it's a combination. It's a combination like we just said about the man, or the pnimis ha'er, midah and loy midah. So there's measure and non-measure. Now, the importance of this of course, is critical, because you want to actually bring a defined and structured world to a place that's beyond structure. But before getting to beyond structure, the man, the Torah, and kahai gavna could be mitzvahs. Remember, we learned about mitzvahs. On one hand, the mitzvah is a specific, detailed mitzvah. On the other hand, Ratzon Hashem, Ratzon Elyon. It's Er HaBli Gvul. It's Er HaMakif, like we learned. So I'm not sure whether kahai gavna is referring to that. It probably means many examples where you can find a combination of measure and non-measure. There's, of course, Mokum Ha'aron Eina Min Hamida, which we discussed, the Rebbe's letter, that the space of the Aron, which is Torah, of course, it was Mokum Ha'aron, is a Mokum, but Eina Min Hamida. So if you measure one way, you find space. You measure the other way, there's also space from wall to wall, and they both come together.
So,
yeah, and Nochanami. So Kahai Gavna includes many scenarios, situations, where you have a combination. So bottom line, we're still in the middle of the subject. So let's be patient till we finish it. So what do we have established now? That the Ein Sof, the bli gvul of Eir HaBli Gvul, is Ein Sof in one element, that it's infinite. But it's not Ein Sof Amiti, which is Mushlam Mahakel, and therefore encompasses everything. It's infinite, but it's defined by its infinity. Er Pnimi, he says, has both elements together mixed. So we have here now the Er HaGvul now, the Pnimis of the Er HaGvul, not the Chetzenis. Because the Chetzenis of the Er HaGvul is the definition of every state. But there's the Pnimis of it that is not defined completely. It's somewhat amorphous even in its definition. I'm going to explain a little bit more after we finish the subject matter, because I don't want to lose the flow here. So he says like this, okay. Harishazed dafke kamoya atzmus. So dafke, this is like atzmus, more than the Er HaSof HaBli Gvul. Why? Kamoya atzmus shababa beis hofchim ke'echad. The fact that you can have a combination, that you should have a measure of man, at the same time it doesn't have measure, because the one who took more or took less, ultimately it equalizes. That seems to be, not seems to be, says this is dafke like atzmus. This is like atzmus, because it's combining two opposites. Atzmus, as we said, is not defined by one or another. It combines everything. V'zehu k'moishin is bar le'il, And this is what we learned earlier in the Maimer B'Yei Mashmini Atzeres. Was that the Maimer I just referred to? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Remember, I just referred to page 1170. So he says, this is what we learned there. The Yesh Leimer, that panimi, that parentheses. See, the parentheses on line 4 on page 1170 is what the Rebbe Rashab is referring to now. So what do we learn there? The Pnimius HaKav hu b'chinas Gili HaEtzem. The inner dimension of the Kav reveals the Etzem. V'zel l'mayla b'chinas Gili HaEtzem the Er Makif. And that's higher than the revealing of the Etzem of the Er Makif. So he's repeating what he said there. I think I would like to read what he said there first, and then we'll continue here. So I'm reading just a few lines in that parentheses. Well, it's actually more than a few lines. Let me just see something. Hold on. Where's that parentheses end? Oh, no. It's 4 lines. I'm reading on page 1170 because I just want to compare how he's going to say this. So he says there like this. There he's talking about Chetzenius HaKav being structured, which is like the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, and Pnimius HaKav being non-structured. Shenim Shem B'chinas Pnimius V'atzmus Ein Sof. So he says V'yesh Leimer, line 4 on 1170. Shazel B'chinas Gili HaEtzem Liyaz B'chinas Er Pnimi. This is the Pnimius HaKav, is the Gili HaEtzem, because it's coming from Atzmos. It's not a lower level. The Gili HaEtzem, as he manifests in Er Pnimi, as the Etzem wants to manifest into an Er Pnimi. The Sheresh Hamshacha Zu, the root of this Hamshacha, he Lamayla Mesheresh Hamshacha, the Gili HaEtzem, B'chinas Er Makif. So Chetzenius HaKav, the outer dimension of the Er Pnimi, is definitely lower than the Er Makif, because the Er Makif is a bli gvul, and the Er Pnimi is a gvul. That's Chetzenius HaKav. But Pnimius HaKav is the Pnimius, the Kavona Atzmi is the Etzem. And that has an element that's even greater than the Er Makif, which is bli gvul. Why? The B'chinas Er Makif, liyesh ezel ha'ara levad. Because the Er Makif, even though it's bli gvul, but at the end of the day, it's just a reflection of the divine. It's only Er Ein Sof. Ima yesh ezel gili ha'atzmus. Even though it's a gili of Atzmus, Atzmus wants to manifest in this Er Makif, in an infinite Er. Nevertheless, it does not have the whole Atzmus in it. It only has the extension of, or only a reflection of the bli gvul of Atzmus. The Gili Etzem, the Er Pnimi, hu b'madreges ha'atzmus. Whereas the Gili Etzem, Er Pnimi, as I explained back then, is madreges ha'atzmus. Why? Because the Er Makif at the end of the day is a means to an end. It was not an end in itself. God is revealing his infinity because he wants that infinite energy should ultimately become part of our existence. But the real kavanah is dira b'tachtenim. God with Etzem wants to have Seif Ma'aser Machshava Tchila. He wants to have a world like ours, a structured world. So the actual paintbrush, or the outer dimension of the Akav that creates the structure, is the implementation, the functional part, and that is take lower than Er Makif, which is the bli gvul part. But the Pnimi's Kavana, the Etzem of the Er Pnimi, is actually capturing what Atzmus really wants. He wants a defined structure where you're going to bring Er HaGvul and Er HaBli Gvul. So in that sense, the Pnimis HaKav carries more of Atzmus in a way than the Er Makif, which is seemingly higher than the Pnimis HaKav because it's rooted in the Igul, which is higher than the Kav. But the Pnimis HaKav goes all the way to the Tiferes of Ein Sof, if you remember. Not like Chetzenius HaKav, which is rooted in Malchus of Ein Sof, because the Chetzenius HaKav is defined by the rules of engaging with existence. Pnimius HaKav is Eberstein looking at how he wants to engage, but he's not engaging. It's not limited yet. It's the etzem in the Pnimius, it's the etzem of the Kav, basically, or the Pnimius of the Kav. So now he's going back and saying that element is there more in the Pnimius HaKav more than the Er HaBli Gvul. So let's read it now. I'm going back to page 1191.
Ayin is like the highest phenomenon going. I mean, we were yesterday or Friday. We looked at it from like one of the lower ones that I was upset about it, and now you're bringing out that it's really the highest phenomenon. Everything.
Well, it doesn't say Ar Ne'enim Min Amida here, just for the record. I said it. Number two, we didn't finish the subject yet. It's not over. Because there's going to be advantage in the Era Bligvul over this as well. He's not changing his position. He's just explaining different elements, as we said. Let's continue. Let's see where he goes here. So he says, it says what we just read. And he's repeating what he said there, but maybe same words, different words. Let's see. The primus akav is a gili of the etzem. The zelamaylam b'chinas gili etzem the makif. It's higher than the revealing of the core of the makif, of the transcendent or the infinite light. Well, who and what? Why? Li is the makif b'chinas bashas ha'ara levad. Imamish repeats the same words because the makif is only an extension and a reflection alone. It's extended reflection alone. Al-Kain, Mashem is dame. Now he's adding. Al-Kain, therefore, Mashem is dame. Ela atzmus, hurak b'mashu bligvul. And therefore, that which is comparable to atzmus is only one thing, one aspect of atzmus, the bligvul, the ability to be unlimited. Not the ability to be undefined and combine opposites, not that aspect of atzmus, the aspect of bligvul of atzmus, the unlimitedness, that everything has no limits, which is also a power that comes from atzmus, obviously. But atzmus is much more than that, as we just learned. So that's what this pastor says. But the pnimi, shebibchinas gili etzem, the pnimi, which is a gili etzem. In other words, how atzmus is following the track or manifesting in the track of pnimi, an internal energy, shezel b'madregas ha'atzmus. That mamish compares to atzmus because it introduces the dimension of combining paradoxes. So this is the interesting twist here. Bligvul, infinite, captures more the unlimitedness. The pnimi, which is on the level of atzmus, how atzmus, in other words, manifests and chooses to manifest in pnimi, is mizdam and mamish. Not just the bligvul, not just one aspect, but he brings together two opposites, measure and non-measure. That's what he's saying here.
This is what it means, כשם שיש לו יותר בלי גבול, כך יש לו יותר בגבול, is talking about the atzmus, not the bli gvul itself.
Lav dafke.
No? Because
the Avedis HaKedesh is not necessarily this. The Avedis HaKedesh is probably a lower level. It depends how you touch the Avedis HaKedesh. There's definitely interpretations. The Avedis HaKedesh says like this: "Kishem sheyesh lekeche bebilti bal gvul, kach yesh lekeche begvul." But it doesn't say that the gvul has a bli gvul in it. So there you can touch that there he's talking already chitzenis hakav. In other words, the idea, because he continues, va'gvul shenimtzum menet chila hu ha'eses sfiris. So I don't know if he's talking about the midah bilti midah. Now you could type the Avedis HaKedesh also, that he's talking about Kashem sheyesh lekeche bebilti ba'gvul, kach yesh lekeche begvul, that the gvul also has that element. Or you could say that the etzem inyan of saying that he has both bli gvul and gvul is also a paradox. The very fact that he has both. But here I think he's going further. He wants to say that in the midah there's bilti midah. Not just there's bli gvul and gvul, but in the gvul there's also a bli gvul. You see what I'm saying? So Avedis HaKedesh is basically making the statement that there are two tracks. But here it goes, I believe, further than that. Okay. So he did not negate what he said before. The bli gvul does have still the advantage that it's telling us about atzmus. The advantage is that it doesn't have measure. And even compared to the pnimi sakav, it reflects infinity. The pnimi, on the other hand, its main advantage is that it's fulfilling the purpose of God, But now he's explaining that the Pnimius of the Pnimi, the Pnimius of has also the element of Mizdama L'Kola Atzmus. Not kol, I'm sorry, Mizdama Mamish Ala Atzmus. There it says Mizdama in the Bli Gvul of Atzmus. And now it's Mizdama Mamish, meaning it also captures the element of paradox. So in other words, if the divine only manifests in Bli Gvul, let's for argument's sake say, you see infinite energy. It doesn't stop. Not bekamus, not be'echus, not in erech, rechev, emek, infinite energy, every possible way. What would you know? You'd know that this light is revealing that God has infinite capacity. But you wouldn't know that he combines paradoxes because you don't see anything of Gvul. You only see infinity. So it's a great level. Infinity is like everything. But you don't necessarily know that he's capable of also manifesting a Gvul and that he's not defined by being infinite. All this you do not know from the infinite. So the infinite does reveal something of great magnitude. I mean, infinity is infinity. No one's denying its mila, its quality. But it does not reveal more than that.
He's calling it
When it comes to Pnimius HaKav, which is coming from the Etzem, not the Kav as it's relating to creating every defined structure of existence. The Kav as it is in its root, it's rooted in a place that combines two things. One hand it's a Kav, it's definitely going to be measured, but the measure doesn't have measure. And that reveals, as he says, Mizdama Mamish, that gives you, if you want, I don't say a deeper, but a more complete, a more complete taste of Atzmus, because now you have this combination, which right away tells you that Atzmus is not defined by one or the other, and that's why you can combine both, as we just learned. Okay. Does anybody want to ask anything before I continue?
That's why he's calling it He'ore. The Bli Gvul is a He'ore. And the
Spashtu Sa'ara, yeah.
I don't know why we wouldn't say that the Or Makif after the Tzimtzum also relates to structure of the world, because my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, that when we tap in human beings in our limited structured world into the levels of the highest levels of Amunah and Mesiras Nefesh and Ratzon, aren't we tapping into this Or Makif from Or Bli Gvul after the Tzimtzum?
So first of all, who says he's talking after the Tzimtzum here? To me, it seems like he's talking before the Tzimtzum. That's number one. Number two, even after the Tzimtzum, when you compare Mesiras Nefesh to daily Aveda, Mesiras Nefesh is called Bli Gvul, and the Aveda daily work that you do in the defined states is called Gvul. So it's fine. It's Bli Gvul as it relates to Gvul. So in the context of the discussion here, it reveals a different dimension than Gvul does. Gvul reveals the divine within existence, and Mesiras Nefesh reveals the divine beyond existence. So,
no, I thought we were saying that the Pnimius HaKav has the Mila over Bli Gvul in reflecting Atzmus because it carries paradoxes at the same time.
And Bli Gvul doesn't carry
I
paradoxes.
would think
That's exactly correct. Both before the Tzimtzum or after the Tzimtzum. Bli Gvul carries one thing. It carries the infinite beyond structure of existence. And Gvul, Pnimius, and Chassidus HaKav carries the Gvul structure of existence. And Pnimius HaKav carries an element of both.
Because if it is true that we do access or Makif, Bli Gvul after the Tzimtzum, if there's such a thing. Again, you said you weren't sure.
So first of all, who said we're talking after the Tzimtzum? Maybe we're talking before the Tzimtzum. Pnimius HaKav, what he's speaking now is most likely before the Tzimtzum. Let's address that. Do you have a question there?
Pnimius HaKav is referred to as before the Tzimtzum?
The root of the Krav, as is before
the
Tzimtzum.
But
yeah.
I thought we were actually talking.
So do you have a question before the Tzimtzum, or your question is only after? Let's just break this down into parts.
I thought the whole discussion right now about the Kav was only after the Tzimtzum. I didn't know we were talking about the source of the Kav before the Tzimtzum. I thought we were.
That's what he says, Shadish. If you look at the words, he says Shadish.
Shorsh HaKav? Where?
Read the words.
Okay. So I was misunderstanding the whole thing. I thought that we're talking about Kav after the Tzimtzum.
Well, the kav after the tzimtzum also has a premise, which is rooted before the tzimtzum. That's my point.
Okay. And Or Makif is also rooted in the Or Bligvul Lifnei Tzimtzum.
Right. So so you're not talking lifnei tzimtzum, right?
No, I've been talking about with after Tzimtzum.
Okay. So first of all,
But-
how do you know that when you do Mesiras Nefesh, maybe you're tapping into the premise akav? How do you know you're tapping into the pure Eira Bligvul?
That's what I don't know. I'm asking you as my teacher. I was my understanding when a person talks connects with levels of a or makif Soviet calling, which is I thought was high, like in the elements of Kesser and above, which not above.
Not necessarily. Not when you talk in general terms, yeah. But when you're talking this type of specifics, it could very well be that's the place where Bligvul and Gvul meet.
Because then
At the end of the day, we want Bligvul and Gvul to meet. That's what's going to happen here. So right now, we're talking about 3 tracks, Bligvul, Gvul, and the Pnimis Akav where Bligvul and Gvul meet. Just think of it that way. So Bligvul is beyond existence. Gvul is existence, is the divine within existence. And then there's the middle, the Pnimis Akav is Bligvul and Gvul meet. So for all practical purposes, at the end of the day, we want them all to combine. And that's, you can't, I mean.
So that's my question. I was thinking that there was, just like there's a level in
Well, Bligvul is Bligvul. What can I tell you? Bligvul is not called Gvul. If you show me a mimer that says Bligvul is called Gvul, then we have a question. The fact that you say that through Avodah we connect, Avodah is connecting everything. V'yadai ta'yem v'shavei levavecha ki Hashem Elokim is all levels of Hashem Elokim. Or it's metachas, b'shamayim mimal. We're talking about hundreds of levels here. At the end of the day, they're all combining Gvul and Bligvul. When you break it down, that's to bring that says some places that we can touch Bligvul makes the Bligvul full. That doesn't say that anywhere. At the end of the day, it's about joining them together, and this is the process that we're discussing.
This is exactly what you said, Simon. In Bichel Maspid, in Chachef Regin and third Chassid, they were in the shul with the Nazis burned the whole entire shul, and they were dancing that they have this chus of Mesiras Nefesh. Why should you dance? Okay, Bligvul in Mesiras Nefesh. Dancing means das will the Eibishter. You bring it down in this world. The Mesiras Nefesh is misgala in your feeling also.
Yeah, but Rabbi Jacobson, I think, was saying that how do we know that's coming from the Or Bligvul or might be coming from Pnimis Akav?
I think this is very distracting, to be very honest. I'm not sure how this affects these talk. Are you trying to tell me that Bligvul is not Gvul? Is not Bligvul? What are you saying? I'm not clear what you're trying to say.
I was trying to ask. It seemed to me that there was an element of Gvul in the Bligvul.
Maybe that's like the Pnimis Akav.
No, I'm just not in Pnimis Akav, in the Or Bligvul
Well, you have a source for that?
No, I'm asking.
I don't know. I don't see that.
My understanding
source for that.
If if structure in this Olam Hazeh Gashmi, if we within our structure.
One second, I answered you. I don't have a source. If you don't have a source and I don't have a source, why are we even discussing?
So this, because it's my understanding, the source of Ratzon and Amuna and the higher levels of Mesiras Nefesh, we're coming from.
Do you understand that there's a thing called Er HaBligvul that God chose to express Himself in infinite Er? Is that understandable to you?
Yes.
That's all we're discussing here.
Before listen at
infinite divine energy, Er HaBligvul.
Mm-hmm.
There's another track called finite energy. The goal is to join the two. There's the premise Akav that brings together Gvul and Bligvul like you're discussing here. So what question do you have? Are you asking what God's track of Er HaBligvul is truly Bligvul or not? It's truly Bligvul. The fact
meaning
that we have ability to touch it doesn't make it less Bligvul.
That was my question, yeah. After I was talking about after the Tzimtzum, I was thinking that we could touch this Or Bligvul that would have some type of finite aspect.
So just because you touch Er HaBligvul doesn't mean the Er HaBligvul becomes full.
Okay. All right.
If somebody goes outside of their parameters in Avodah, b'chol ma'odcha, they go outside of their regular structure. So it says they touch ma'od l'mayla, the bligvul l'mayla. That doesn't make the bligvul gvul. It means that you touch bligvul for a moment.
Mhm. Okay. I was trying to think that there would be symmetry. I guess I'm wrong between that. Within or panimi, the panimi is a kav. It carries both aspects of bligvul and gvul at the same time. And I would think that the or bligvul has symmetry.
I would strongly suggest for us to be simple Jews and just learn the Maimer as the Rebbe Rashab is teaching it to us, without trying to read more than what he's saying. It's complicated enough as it is. So
Okay.
let's just continue reading, and let's see where he goes with it. We're middle of a sentence, literally, middle of a paragraph. I would suggest to continue reading without processing and not trying to bring other stuff into it. To me, it's confusing, and I'm sure to others as well.
Okay.
I'm just, to me, it's like, it's very clear what he's saying right now. It says,
Okay.
there's Eira Gvul. Each one reflects Shemayim Emal, Va'aretz Mitachas. Each one, so one, he said, is similar to, and Mizdame, it's comparable to the Bligvul of Atzmus, the infinity, that things don't have limits. Then there's another, like he said, the Eir L'Hoyer Esa Elemis, Eir Pnimi, which is finite, the energy of Elohim that manifests within existence. He's speaking about the quality of the Bligvul one. In speaking about the quality, he said, yes, it does compare us and does give us a taste of Atzmus, but we know that Atzmus is beyond infinite as well and can be defined. So he's saying now that the Pnimi Sa'ir actually has an element where you do see paradoxes, where in the Bligvul you don't see it. That's what he's saying right now. That's what he's saying. So I would suggest let's continue reading this and as best as we can. And if there's any questions that remain, we'll address it afterwards.
Fine.
Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson, you said, I don't see where the word is a shorish of the kav. When it says mistamid ma'ashel atzmus, it just seems to be talking about the kav in general, or panimi in general. I don't see.
Okay, that's why you need to remember what we learned earlier. So let me refer you, first of all, to page, if you remember, look in the parentheses. Why did I read page 1170? Because I wanted to show you the context. So I'm going to refer you to a few places. And you could trust me on this, because I do usually keep the flow of the Maimorim going. So look at the second line in the parentheses. Sheidish Hamshacha Zu. That's number one, okay? So it says there the root of this Hamshach. Number two, go to page, the page, let's see here. Where's the page about Pnimis and Chetzenis Hakav where he begins discussing it?
I don't remember what pages they are. Sorry.
I thought you said 1170.
I will tell you. So if you go to page,
Weren't you saying 1170?
page 11, actually, no, same 1170. I'm sorry. Go further down 1170, you'll see it very, very clear. Chetzenis Hakav is rooted in Malchus of Ein Sof, rooted. Malchus of Ein Sof is before the Tzimtzum. Pnimis Hakav is rooted in Teferes of Ein Sof. Teferes of Ein Sof is before the Tzimtzum in the Esses Friedus Hagnuzes. If you read further down that page, you'll see it.
Okay, good. But that means that we're only discussing the kav.
1 second. Hold on.
Tzimtzum. Doesn't mean that that's talking about it shorish before, but it doesn't mean we're talking about it now, and it doesn't repeat it talking about shorish. It tells us where it comes from.
What difference does it make in the context of our conversation here? It goes like this. The context is this.
Yeah.
The Chetzenis Hakav is midah v'gvul. It's structured and it's engaging with tailored toward creation. The Pnimis Hakav after the Tzimtzum has in it, as I explained maybe 40 times, the artist's intentions when he uses his paintbrush to create the details. There's the Pnimis Hakav, which is rooted in the pnimius of the artist, lifnei tzimtzum, in his intention. Why is he creating an er pnimi in the first place? So essentially, there's a link between the outer kav to the inner part of the kav. There was discussion about this is at least 5-6 pages in Ayin Beis. I would suggest strongly to go back and read it all, because I'm being informed by what he said. And that pnimius carries these two elements. On one hand, God wants structure. On the other hand, it's not yet structured because it's all within himself. And like he called the medida atzmis, and the man or teira and all the other examples we spoke about capture this combination of measure and non-measure. So chitzeni sekav is midah. Er habligvul er makif igul igulim igul hagadol is makif bligvul. And the pnimius sekav has an element that's even deeper than the er makif because it's rooted in that pnimius, like he calls it, etzem. Gili ha'etzem. Masha atzmus. Shezel madregas ha'atzmus. Madregas ha'atzmus is far higher than the tzimtzum. So it's how atzmus is envisioning the er pnimi, as I've been explaining. And that element is combination that is mizdama mamish ala atzmus, because it carries those two elements. Now that's carried over into the pnimius hakav after the tzimtzum, but it stays concealed. Because remember, it's the pnimius hakav. It's not the chitzenius hakav. It's not the kav as it's functioning. It's the driving force behind the functionality of the outer defined dimension of the kav. It's basically, if you wish, the non-definition within the definition of the kav. Non-definition, by what I mean by that is the beyond definition within the definition of the kav. In other words, the structured existence is not just, we look at it, we see a structure, but there's an element of beyond structure within the structure. And that's where the kav comes, the pnimius kav comes into play. The beyond structure within the structure, which is different than the er habligvul, which is just beyond structure and not structure.
Yeah, okay, very fine. We all understand has a shorish, but here on page 1191, we're talking about there's a medida atzmis by the kav. And the medida atzmis by the kav seems to be within the kav itself, where it has a chitzenius, which is nimdad, according to the stalshuls. It sounds like they're both in the same darga. And also, if looking ahead,
I'm not
right
sure what
after
you
that,
just said that's different than I said, just for the record.
what I'm saying is that where it's found, the medida.
No, I'm saying what you said, I don't see anything different than what I just said.
Right. I agree 100%, but I think it sounds like, just like you said, the pnimius kav has that quality, always has a pnimius kav has that quality after tzimtzum, because here we're talking about it, let me finish the statement, talking about the very same breath, we're talking about the medida by chitzenius kav, and also just after that statement, it says, when they say, Adam Elyon, we found Adam Elyon in every darga.
We didn't read that. We didn't read that yet.
I know, but we will in a second.
So let's read it then, and we'll discuss it.
Okay, good.
Okay, so in other words, pnimi, as it's seen from the eyes of the source. So to use an example that I've used in the past, you have the king, you have the chief of staff, and you have the departments, the department heads, and each department has to do what it has to do. So the chitzenius hakav is the departments, each department doing its function. It's being informed by the chief of staff, who is being informed by, the chief of staff is like the er habligvul. His role is only one thing, to convey what the king wants. Doesn't make a difference what it is. The pnimius hakav is, what is the king's intention with the specific jobs that each department has to do? So the chief of staff it bypasses him. All he's doing is conveying whatever Atzmus wants, whatever the king wants. So it's essentially just reflecting the source's infinite capacity. But then there is the aspect of what is the intention within the specifics that each department has to do. So there's the specific function, that's the chitzenius hakav. And the intention behind it all, within the mind of the king, within the mind of the artist, and so on, That's the Pnimius HaKav. So he says, that's Gili HaEtzem, Shezeb Madregas Mizdama Mamash Atzmus. That's Mizdama because it's carrying these two opposites. The Bligvul itself only carries the infinite reflection. So it says, yes, it is reflecting godliness in a pure form, without filters. Like we said earlier, it doesn't have anything. There's no additional will there to define it. All it is an infinite light. But so it's mizdam el atzmus in the bligvul part of it, whereas here it's mizdam mamash el atzmus. So now he continues in the parentheses. V'yesh lemer, and we can say shezeh inyan adam adam el elyon, that this is the inyan of the adam. You may remember. Well, not just remember, when we spoke before in the Maimer Koyamar Hashem, the previous Maimer, the whole discussion in the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, where he said, Ubara Odam al Kula, he created the man above them all. So he said, Odam is Shem Ma, Panemius Milagav, Shem Ma Milagav, Panemius Akav. The Panemius, so when God created existence, he created a structure. Then he said, Kigavna, he created the lower world, should be similar to the higher world. That's due to the power of Ein Sof, which is higher than lower and higher. That's why you can make Biyah similar to Atzilus. But then he asked, how is that implemented? How is that implemented? That remains a power of Ein Sof. And the answer is Adam Bara al Kula. He put Adam. Adam is the carrier of the Pnimius HaKavana. 6 days of creation was the structure. God created heaven and earth. Yehi Rakia, Desha, the world of plants and vegetation, the celestial bodies. He created a whole stage called the world, the physical world. Adam, on the 6 days created, he's carrying Pnimius HaKav. What's the Pnimius HaKavana in all of this? The Kavana is to elevate it all. And the Adam has the power to do so because he's carrying Shema Milagav, the Shema within, the Pnimius. It's like basically the world was created by these pipelines, but you need someone who understands what's the purpose of all these pipelines. And that's the Pnimius. So the Adam is, Adam Adama Le'elyon means it's similar to above, Adama, Dimyan, like he used the word Mizdama, it's similar to above. The Adam, who B'chinas Pnimius, because the Adam is the inner dimensions. So therefore he's similar in the full sense. He carries all the instructions of God on all levels. That's the previous Maimer. The Maimer Koyamar Hashem. We talked at length about Adam. Yeah.
He carries all the intentions.
Well, actually, it began on page, just if you want to have it, 11. Let me finish. Page 1184 is where he discussed it at length and on. So that's the Adam. V'hu Adam le'elyon mamish. Uses the word mamish again. Mizdam mamish. In other words, the Adam brings together these paradoxes, where on one hand, it's a human being, a structured human being placed in this world, but at the same time, the Adam has a neshama and is connected to the divine instructions above, so it also can bring an element that's beyond structure into the structure, as we learned back then. On page, again, 1184 at length, we remember the whole thing with Hiskalulus and Bittel, that Adam has Hiskalulus. He brings together Kelebatz and Madregas HaYesel and Madregas HaYesel Tachtenis. You see in the Adam these elements of Pnimius HaKav. I think he actually says it even, yeah, for sure. Pnimius Adam, yeah. So page 1184 through 11, actually all the way till the end of the Maimer, till 1188. And how a person does it through mitzvahs, and how is he zeichet to it? Because he comes from the highest levels. On page 1187, we talk Bani Matam, the neshamas that come from the highest levels. Yeah. Good. That's in that Maimer where he talks about how Adam brings it down to earth. And that earth is not a second, not duality. And now he's saying even deeper that Adam brings it. Okay. Any further questions right now?
Okay.
So
Yeah, I had a
maybe
question.
Maybe a possibility we're talking about Pnimius HaKav Mamish after Tzimtzum. It sounds that way.
The Kav, the period, Kav is only after the Tzimtzum. There's no Chiddush in saying that. Kav never happens before the Tzimtzum. But where does the Kav get its power to bring together the Primis HaKav. That's why I explained, go back to the page I referred to you, 1170, where he talks about the root of the Kav in Malchus of Ein Sof and Teferes of Ein Sof. Kav, by definition, is only after Tzimtzum. There is no narrow thread of light unless there's a Tzimtzum, a total Tzimtzum.
Right.
So there's no question that Kav is after the Tzimtzum. That's not even a discussion. The question is where the Kav and what is it reflecting? Right now, he's explaining that Primis HaKav is reflecting something even greater than Eir HaBlikvul is reflecting. That's all he's saying, both before the Tzimtzum, in the root, and after the Tzimtzum.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yes, but it's correct to say that we are talking after the Tzimtzum. V'yadaita hayayim v'shavesa levavecha is in the world that we exist. Remember, it's mamata l'mayla. We're coming to be aware and to feel godliness in existence. So we are talking, in our reality, we're going from the bottom up, first recognizing ba'aretz metachas, the ayin of the yesh hanivra, das tachten, the divine within existence. Now we're coming to understand the divine beyond existence. And now he's talking about the Primis HaKav is something in between the two. The reason I brought before the Tzimtzum, because I wanted to explain that the whole idea is rooted there. That's where it's coming from when you talk about these deeper levels. But yes, in bottom line is we're talking after the Tzimtzum here. That is correct.
So let me ask you this question, since we're saying the source of it comes from before the Tzimtzum. It's the Shem Ma is called Shem Ma Mechodosh. And that comes from Adam Kadmon. Now after we had the Shviras HaKelim in Darga, we have the Shem Ma Chodosh. It sounds like the whole birth, the whole inception of Shem Ma came after Tzimtzum, after the Shviras HaKelim. It sounds like a later stage, but we're tying up Panemius HaKav, Shiur HaKav, and Tiferes with Shem Ma. How do they work?
So what's the question? I mean, everything is rooted before the Tzimtzum. Everything is. I'm not sure, but Shema Ma'achodesh. You just said it. It's called Achodesh because it comes after the Shviras HaKelim.
Yeah.
So what do you say? It's rooted. It's rooted in Ak before Shviras HaKelim, in Ab. It's rooted in Shem Ab, if you recall from volume 1.
Yeah.
So what are we saying? What do you?
In other words, that shame, even though Shem Ab, it's from Adam Kadmon, okay, it still carries that Panemius, that Shurish. That's the way it was.
I don't know. That you need to. That he doesn't say that here. We'd have to go back to the Maimorim in volume 1 where he talks about it to see exactly what's what. But generally speaking, Atzilus is Adam Elyon. Atzilus is the level of Adam that brings his skalulus. So Atzilus definitely has the Primis HaKav working there to make sure there's a skalulus, that everything works together, which is the Shem Ma'achodesh in Atzilus. That I could tell you. That's clear, because Atzilus is the perfect world where you have existence and everything's working together. But Atzilus is a structured existence. The element of Iskalus and other elements receive energy from Kav and the Primis HaKav, Chetzenius HaKav, different elements. Anyway, let's continue where we are right now. So it's okay. Now he's going to say that with all that we've just said now, nevertheless, there's still a quality in the Eir HaBlikvul. Even though we just explained that the Panemius Eir has this Mizdama Mamish because it brings together the paradoxes, the opposites, he's going to say, Mekol Mokem, nevertheless, Bizgalos Eir Sof HaBlikvul, nevertheless, there's a quality, the revelation of the infinite light, infinite divine light, Mizdama Yesel Atzmus Ein Sof, Mbashahu B'chinas Ein Sof B'gili. Okay. I already said this earlier just for clarity, but he's saying it now explicitly. So it still has something, has a quality. It's more comparable to Atzmus in what aspect? In that it's Ein Sof B'gili. Because at the end of the day, the Panemius HaKav or Panemius HaEir that we just discussed, yes, in concept, it's achieving something in quality that brings together opposites. And in that sense, it's similar to Atzmus Mamish, more Mamish similar more than the Eir HaBlikvul. But if you talk about in sheer firepower, so to speak, in sheer expression of the infinite divine, where do you see the Begilui? You don't see it in Primis HaKav because Primis HaKav, the focus is on the structure. However, in the structure, to experience beyond structure. In Eir Ein Sof HaBlikvul, all you see is Blikvul Mamish, Ein Sof Mamish, Ein Sof Begoli, Begili. So it's true, it doesn't express the element of paradoxes or the element that God is undefined and there's muslil, shelil hakel, shlilis hakel. That it does not express. But it does express sheer infinity, the sheer power. Similar to what we say, what is higher? I don't know if he's going to bring this, but what is higher, a miracle or nature? So Chassidus talks about the two zdarim from the Sefer HaKedah, Kedah Yitzchak. There's a Sefer called Kedah Yitzchak. Chassidus brings it very often, especially today's Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So Chassidus brings it in the context of the difference between Tishrei and Nisan. That Tishrei is the Rosh Hashanah of Anhogas HaTeva. So one order God created is the natural order. What is the natural order defined by? And the second order is the miraculous order, Hanhoga Nisis. And Nisan is the Rosh Chodesh of is the Rosh Hashanah of Hanhoga Nisis. Two tracks. What is the difference between them? One is defined by consistency. Lo yushbesu, yom v'layla. A consistency that is awesome. It will always be day and there'll be night. The sun will rise, the sun will set, the moon will rise, the moon will set. All the celestial bodies, all matters on earth. You see how animals breed, how nature is balanced. A tremendous clockwork consistency of awesome design. What does that reveal? That reveals God's power of consistency. So it's a power, but it's the power within structure. The infinite amount, how to say the word infinite, the power of the divine in structure. What does Nisi represent? The suspension of structure, the suspension of the laws of nature. When you suddenly see a sea part, the Yamsuf, that water and land are always separate. And suddenly, middle of the water separates and you can walk through it. Or you see actual revealed miracles. I'm talking about the most revealed possible miracles. I'm not talking about Purim right now, which is actually like the Primis Akav, where it brings both together. I'm talking about true open miracle, where a real suspension of nature, that reveals, as he explains, and Chassidus explains, the Eir HaBligvul. Not the Eir HaGvul. The Eir HaGvul is captured the divine through consistency, through rules, through structure. Its structure is what's so powerful. And the Eir HaBligvul is in its suspension of structure, a miracle that completely is different than anything you've ever seen. So it's exact opposite type of revelation. So which one is greater? The answer is, Chassidus explains, the truth is Teva is the deepest. Why? Because in structure, you see such an element of consistency. It has like the combination of infinite consistency in the finite. Whereas a miracle is only powerful because it breaks the structure. But can it also exist within the structure? So Teva teaches us that God, the godly power exists within structure. But if you talk about sheer firepower, so to speak, like what elevates us? Why do we need miracles then? So the Rebbe explains, the Chassidus explains, Orim Nisi, because a miracle in your life, if you right now see that a person who's lying ill in the hospital and suddenly miraculous, and the doctors give up hope, and suddenly you see miraculous healing, not a natural healing, something that everybody did not expect. What happens is, in the Gilui of it, in Giluyim, the Nes is more powerful because the Nes is revealed, like he says, Ein Sof Begili. Whereas Teva is much more within the structure. In other words, it's a Nes, but it's all within. Whereas here, it really is a shocker, essentially. It shocks you. Nature doesn't shock anybody. Nobody is shocked by the fact that the sun rises every morning, precisely because it happens every morning. Since it's so consistent, we're not even spoiled from it. What does the Baal Shem Tov say? That nature is just there's no difference to nature except frequency. Nature, if the sun were to rise once in our lifetime, would be a shock, would be a novelty. Nature, basically, the Chacham Tzvi says that nature is a bunch of miracles happening one after the other so rapidly you don't see it. But a miracle has that power that can, for the moment. But you can't live on miracles. Ein Semchen ala Nes, because remember, the novelty will wear off. So it's good to lift people up for a moment, but it's not a good way to live by, because you can't keep that high going all the time. So therefore, you need both. There's a whole discussion about the Rebbe and the Frierdiker Rebbe. I don't want to say a debate, the Rebbe was demanding from the Frierdiker Rebbe that after the Holocaust and after the Tzaras Jews went through, we need miracles, open miracles. And the Frierdiker Rebbe insisted that's not the derech of Torah, not the derech of Chassidus. And the Rebbe kept insisting because he said, but the Sof Kol Sof, we're weak. We need to be elevated. We need that jolt, so to speak. We need that revelation. And we all, how many times people say, I wish there was a miracle. I wish God would reveal himself to me. And you'll say, 1 second, he's revealing himself to you all the time. You're breathing, you're walking, you're talking, you have a family, you're healthy. Is that God not revealing himself? But we don't call it revelation. We call it, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I have to use my mind to think about that. A real miracle, if right now, middle of Eastern Parkway, the whole city, the whole parkway would split, and suddenly you saw Atzilus come out, then I'd get excited. But we all know that's a short-term excitement. The point is, what he's saying here is that the Ir HaBligvul has the element that is comparable to Asmus, Ein Sof, is the fact that it's Ein Sof Begili. That you see a revealed form of Ein Sof. Whereas in the Pnimis Ha'er, you don't see Ein Sof Begili, you see paradox. You see something that's even beyond miracles, actually. But you don't have that Gili of Ein Sof as you do in Ir HaBligvul. That's just one explanation among many in understanding the value of the so-called Ir HaBligvul. Okay, before I continue, I'm elaborating again because the Rebbe Rashab just says it in one line and it needs explanation. Does anybody want to ask anything before I read? Because he's now going to go and explain the whole thing with the Kav, the Reshimu, Pnimis Er Makif, and all that in context of this what we're discussing here. Wow, pretty heavy stuff here, that I can tell you. Okay, so let's read on. So this explains what I said, as I mentioned before, why we have, let's say, a Yom Tov like Pesach, that's miracles. A Yom Tov like Purim, which is miracles hidden in nature, and then the rest of the year. So Purim is a Yom Tov, but it's not a Yom Tov where you saw something that was glaringly open miracle. You have to look at the 9 years that passed, and you look in retrospect, and you connect the dots, you see the result was a miracle. And then you have pure nature, which is also divine, but that would be the regular schedule of our lives. Just to round out what I just said. Okay, good. Ukaduma kazais, hugamkein. An example like this, we also find Be'inyan Reshimu. Remember the Reshimu. Let's go back to the Reshimu. So he mentioned on top of this page that the Kav, which is affected obviously by the Tzimtzum. Remember again, the Tzimtzum concealed all the Ir HaBligvul and also left room now for existence that should be Elamis Pshitus. That existence should feel itself as an independent reality, and godliness is not the given reality. Then after the Tzimtzum comes a Kav. The Kav obviously is a light that originates before the Tzimtzum, because the Tzimtzum doesn't have light. So it originates before the Tzimtzum. But it's a light that's been impacted by the Tzimtzum. But when we say Tzimtzum, when you break down the Tzimtzum, the anatomy of the Tzimtzum, you really mean Tzimtzum and Reshimu. The Reshimu is the residue or the trace left from whatever was there before the Tzimtzum. So in Chassidus, there's a long discussion what the Reshimu is. It's a mysterious entity, but the Rebbe Rashab actually is mechadish about the Reshimu that there's two aspects to it. One is only a trace, meaning it's the hidden letters that when the Kav will shine through them, will bring alive and be the root of the containers. But on the other hand, when we call it a trace, it's a trace of everything before the Tzimtzum. And there's a chiddush from the Rebbe Marash that actually the Kopister, his nephew, argued with him that the Rebbe Marash said that the Tzimtzum be'esis Reshimu loy noga b'hem Tzimtzum. That the letters of the Reshimu, in other words, this trace, the Tzimtzum did not impact. That's why it remained. But on the ostensible level, it seems like the mere fact you call it a trace means it's a Tzimtzum. So Chassidus explains, the Rebbe Rashab explains, and we're going to talk about it a bit here, how the Reshimu carries an undiluted message from pre-Tzimtzum. However, it's in a concealed state. So it just adds another dimension of Achdus, of unity, because as it stands right now, the Tzimtzum took place. The Kav has a light coming from before the Tzimtzum, but it's very much impacted by the Tzimtzum. And even the Pnimius HaKav, which does carry a message from higher levels, but it still has to go through the Chitzenius HaKav. So the Reshima adds one more thing, that you have a full picture of what happened before the Tzimtzum, except it's concealed. So think of it like someone took a snapshot of the pre-Tzimtzum consciousness and placed it within the hole, within the empty space of the Tzimtzum, but concealed it. It's the Kav that will reveal it. So you have here a lot of paradoxes going on here. So in that sense, on one hand, the Kav is affected by the Reshimu. On the other hand, the Reshimu will be the root of the containers, which is the Kavana of where the Kav is supposed to enter into. And on the other hand, the Kav reveals it all. So you have here a lot of things going on. Now, what about the Er HaBligvul? We'll soon learn about that. The Er HaBligvul, first of all, hovers above them all. But the Er HaBligvul, we know the Kalim have a connection to it. I think he's going to refer to that. Maybe he won't. So I don't want to confuse it until we learn it inside. So he's now going to use what we just learned. And this is really tying together what I just said is a lot coming from volume 1, literally the first 20, 30 pages, where he talks a lot about the Reshimu and the Kav and what the role of each one of them is. The other day I mentioned that the Reshimu connects to the Koyach HaGvul, which is different than the Er HaGvul. The Er HaGvul is divine energy that goes into the containers. But the very containers themselves, who creates the guf, the body, the container? The neshama does not create the container. It energizes it. It reveals it, but it doesn't create it. So the Reshimu, the Kalim have their own root. Generally speaking, that root is an Er HaBligvul, not an Er HaGvul, interestingly. So the Er HaGvul reveals it, but the Er HaGvul, so let's see how he's going to we're going to read this inside now in context of what we're discussing here. Is the
Reshimu the Tzimtzum?
Tzimtzum means concealment. The Reshimu means trace. Generally speaking, when you say Tzimtzum, you include Tzimtzum and Reshimu. Yeah. But when you break it down, Tzimtzum is the concealing part, and Reshimu is the trace that remains.
The Reshimu is before the Tzimtzum or after the Tzimtzum?
The Tzimtzum, there's no word, the word trace is only possible after the Tzimtzum. But the Reshimu loy noga boy had Tzimtzum is the expression. So in other words, the Reshimu remains after the Tzimtzum, and in some ways is not impacted by the Tzimtzum.
You say
I have to go back to different classes where I spoke about this more at length. I don't want to go that right now into that. It's going to be distracting a bit. Even though he's going to speak, actually I will go into it, but once he says it, I don't want to go into it before we learn it inside. He's going to say it right now. Okay, here's what he says now. It's a trace. A reshem means that something is left over. Like in other words, I mentioned, let's say you write some letters on a page and then you erase it, and you see a trace of those letters. That's a Reshimu. There's actually 4 examples in Chassidus for the Reshimu. But let's write now. Reshem legabe ha'er shenistale kenedem. So the Ur was there. The Ur filled all of existence. Then it was concealed, but a Reshem of that Ur remained. And that's why it's called Reshem, because the Gabi, the Ur, that was all revealed, it's only like a Reshem. V'hadei Reshimu le'nogaba hatzimtzum. The mishum zeh nishara harishima. So we say the Reshimu le'nogaba hatzimtzum. That's why something remained. Because if the Tzimtzum had impacted it, it should have gone the same place Ein Sof Habligvul went, which was to be concealed. Why is there a Reshimu? Because something remained. Va'ir shenistalik hari nogaba had Tzimtzum. And the air that was concealed, the Tzimtzum did impact. And here's the Chiddush from the Reb Marash. B'dibra maschel matzah zu tofresh mem. Is the Pesach of matzah zu maimer hemshech of the Rebbe Marash tofresh mem, which is the year 1880. So the Rebbe Rashab asks, I'll explain this shortly. Let me just read it and then I'll explain. V'im kein eich hu b'chinas reishon levad legabe er shenistalik. So what is he asking? So how could you say it's only a Reshim compared to the Eresh and Stalik? Yeah. If the Reshim alay nogabat Tzimtzum and the Eir, which is more powerful than the Reshim, this is only a trace of that light. That light was concealed. The Reshim that remained from that light, which is only a trace of it, was not affected. So why is it only a Reshim compared to the Eir and Stalik? It seems to be something a lot more than that. That's what I think he's asking. Achzehu, he's explained. Let's read it and then I'll again explain. Achzehu lefisha reshimu b'chinas ke'echad. What? Did someone say something? Achzehu.
If the oil is Stalik, how could be a Roisha?
That's what he's asking. I just said that's what he's asking. So imkain eichu b'chinus reishim levad legabe ershin estalik, since the ershin estalik nogabat tzimtzum and the reishim le nogabat tzimtzum. So he says, ach zehu lefisha reshimu b'chinus ke'echad.
Maybe it's saying that if it's
he's in the middle.
If it's not affected,
I'm middle of reading. Why don't we just finish reading? I'll try to explain, and then anybody can come away in. Okay. Achzehu, however, this is due to the fact that Fisha Reshimu b'chinas ke'ech hagvul shebe ein sof. So he's explaining what this means. That on one hand you say it's only a trace, on the other hand it's not affected by the tzimtzum. So he says, because the Shimu really is the ke'ech hagvul shebe ein sof. It's the power of the finite within Ein Sof, the power to create finite. Va'er shenistalik, and the light, that the energy that was concealed, hu b'chinas Ein Sof habligvul, is the infinite light. So then, if that's the case, why is the Reshimu called a Reshimu? Why don't you just call it ke'ech hagvul? That the infinite light is concealed, the ke'ech hagvul remains after the tzimtzum. So he says, so why is it called Reshimu? Because when you compare the ke'ech hagvul, or the level of gvul rather, the finite compared to infinite, it's only a trace, because infinite is everything and finite is one or limited. So that's why he's calling it a Reshim. The truth is that the Rebbe Rashab explains elsewhere, in Ayin Beis as well, that the Reshimu has two aspects to it. One, it's a ke'ech hagvul intact, completely intact. It's like taking the ke'ech hagvul that was there before the tzimtzum and now placing it after the tzimtzum. That's the tzimtzum, and the Reshimu is the ke'ech hagvul. Another aspect is how it relates to the Eir. It relates to the Eir, that it's only a Reshimu, meaning it's only a trace, it's only a concealed state, not a revealed state like Eir is. So those are the two aspects to the Reshimu. But it's true that Tzimtzum itself and the Reshimu both go into the category of Koyach HaGvul. Now let me explain that a moment.
Wow, you were just saying applicable.
Let's use the example of the teacher. The teacher has an infinite mind, infinitely brilliant. He now chooses that he wants to communicate to a student that is finite. He can't just take his brilliance.
Read it for me.
Can we everybody put on silent? If you don't mind, everybody go on silent so it's no distractions. So now, what does he do? In his own mind, infinite mind, he introduces a new tool. It's called the Koyach HaGvul. The Koyach HaGvul is going to be the power to restrain that infinite energy. This is called the Koyach HaTzimtzum, Koyach HaGvul. If he didn't have a Koyach HaTzimtzum, Koyach HaGvul, he wouldn't be able to teach. His brilliance would be all dominating, all omnipresent, and that would be it. So the Koyach HaGvul is that ability to restrain. He also needs a Ur HaGvul, because he has to now, because Koyach HaGvul is just silence. It just quiets everything down and is the power to restrain. But you need some flow of consciousness. So that's why there's an Ur HaGvul, which is taking the intelligence and the Tzimtzum, the Koyach HaGvul is now, think of it like a dam. You know, water is rushing without stop. But you can't have the water rushing because it will destroy everything in its path. So you build a dam, that's the Tzimtzum, and the Reshimu, as we'll see in a moment. And on the other side of the dam, you allow little pipes or holes to stream the water through in a way that can be contained. So you need three things here. The water is the bli gvul before the dam. You need the dam, the Koyach HaGvul, to stop the flow. And you need the Ur HaGvul that will be coming from the air that was before the Tzimtzum, that will come in a measured way, which is the Kav. So you have Ur and Sof, ha-bli gvul, you have Tzimtzum and Reshimu, and you have the Kav. Now, the Koyach HaGvul itself, the power of Gvul, is not...
And Ur HaGvul also. You didn't say that. That Koyach
I just spoke about it for 5 minutes for the record.
Okay.
Okay. Now the power of Koyach HaGvul is not affected by the Tzimtzum, because it is the Tzimtzum. That's its power. It's God's Kain Hein Gvuresav, his power to restrain himself. That's not affected by the Tzimtzum because that's his power. However, the power does not manifest in Gilui. It manifests in silence, in restraint. So on one hand, this power is completely intact after the Tzimtzum, but it's a Koyach HaGvul, so it's concealed. On the other hand, it's a Reshimu. Why is it a Reshimu? Because compare it, if you put it right near the firepower of the Gili of Eira Bli Gvul, you say, what's stronger, the power of restraint or the power of revelation? So the truth is the power of restraint requires more energy. But in Giluyim, the power of Gilui is obviously on a higher level. So that's why it's called a Reshimu, but at the same time, it was not impacted by the Tzimtzum because it is essentially the power of Gvul that God has. And the Kav will combine both of them because it comes from before. It's light on one hand, but it's affected by the Tzimtzum at the same time. So here's what he says. Same thing is with Pnimis Sa'er. We're talking about the Pnimis of the Kav. Even though it is a Gilia Atzmus, like we learned, in a much higher level than the power of Bli Gvul, because it captures the idea of paradox and Hofchim, the two opposites. So it's more mamish, closer to Atzmus, more similar to Atzmus in that fashion. Nevertheless, Eiden Sefer Bli Gvul, being that it's infinite in nature, page 1192. Nevertheless, it has an advantage over Pnimis Se'er, which at the end of the day comes in the form of measure. In other words, the reason that it's called a Reshimu, why is it called a Reshimu? Why is the Koyach HaGvul not as powerful as Koyach HaBli Gvul? Because when you talk about Giluyim, the Ein Sof is much more revealed. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying the same thing with Pnimis Se'er and Bli Gvul Er. That Pnimis Se'er, though in its root it captures the essence of what the divine wants, the combination of opposites, etc. But the bottom line is the Eira Bligvul is Ein Sof Begili. So therefore, that's why that's giving an example to explain why there's a mile in Eira Bligvul, like there's a mile in Eira and Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum over the Reshimu, even though the Reshimu remains intact and is the Koyach HaGvul. That's how I understand what he's saying here. I can't say it's 100%, but I'm pretty confident that it is. I want to read it again and again, and I have to stop here. We're going to learn more about it, obviously, it's continuing. So we stop at the top of page 1192. And so now we've come to the twist where the Eira Bligvul has in Giluyim a higher state because of its Gilui. I want to talk more about the Reshim, but I'll need more time. So I'll do this in the next class, obviously. So I'm stopping at the top of page 1192. Does anybody want to ask anything?
Yeah, Simon, I'm not very clear about what does it mean, Bchinas הגבול, or is it Bchinas Reshem levad, לגבי Bchinas bli gvul? Why is it?
Because I have limited time, I suggest listen to the recording of what I just
explained.
explained.
I did not understand it the first second also.
So that's why I said, listen again. That's how we do it. That's what I do when I want to understand. Listen again. If you still have questions, I'll address it next class. Anything else anybody want to bring up? Okay, so if not, we stop here, top of page 1192. I'll review this, don't worry. We'll review it again